Great. Oh, we got a couple more people coming. Thanks, Deirdre. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm so thrilled to have you all here on an unusually sunny day in Ann Arbor in November. My name is Tom Braun. I am a professor here on the Ann Arbor campus at the School of Public Health, and I'm here today in my role as chair of the Senate Assembly in SACUA. So again, welcome. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the 33rd Annual Davis Margaret Nickerson Lecture on Academic and Intellectual Freedom. This year's event features Dr. Jonathan Freedman, who is Director of Free Expression and Education Programs at Pan America. He'll be presenting a lecture entitled Academic Freedom 2024, Educational Gag Orders, State Censorship, and the Fight for Higher Education. This lecture series is named for three University of Michigan faculty members, Chandler Davis, Clement Markert, and Mark Nickerson. In 1954, all three of them were called to testify before the House Un-American Activities Committee. All three declined to answer questions about their political associations, which led to their suspension from the University of Michigan. After subsequent hearings and committee actions, Markert, an assistant professor, was reinstated here at the University of Michigan and eventually gained tenure. But both Davis, an instructor, and Nickerson, a tenured associate professor, were both dismissed. To honor all three faculty members, in 1990, the Senate Assembly established the Davis-Markert-Nickerson Lecture on Academic and Intellectual Freedom. And at the same time, the Academic Freedom Lecture Fund was established, which tasked with fundraising for the event and the related activities, under the leadership of Assistant Research Scientist Emerita Peggy Hollingsworth, who was a former SACUA chair. Through her leadership, the lecture has been a vibrant event for more than 3 decades on our campus. In 2018, a Senate Assembly Committee was then established to carry forward the effort. So I'd like to acknowledge the members of the Senate Assembly Davis-Margaret-Nickerson Academic Freedom Lecture Committee, better known as the DMN Committee, who worked diligently this year to identify and confirm this year's speaker, including this year's committee co-chairs Michael Atzman and Melanie Tanenan, who will moderate the question and answer session during today's lecture. The first lecture was given on February 18th, 1991 by Robert M. O'Neill, General Counsel of the American Association of University Professors, Professor of Law, and past President of the University of Virginia. And fortunately, at the first event, Davis, Markert, and Nickerson were all present and participated in a panel discussion. However, all three men have since passed, Mark Nickerson in 1998, Clement Markert in 1999, and Chandler Davis just over 1 year ago. Nonetheless, Professor Tanenan, will be sharing words of Chandler Davis with us shortly. So with that, it's my great pleasure to now introduce Dr. Melanie Tanenan, who is an associate professor in the history department at the University of Michigan Ann Arbor, and also the director of the Program for International and Comparative Studies. She is a historian of war and society, and her research and teaching interests include the social and cultural history of World War I in the Middle East, the emergence of religious philanthropic societies, and their work in times of conflict, the histories of modern humanitarianism, disease, medicine, and mental health. And so, with my pleasure, I now welcome Dr. Tanenan to the podium.
Thank you very much, Tom, for that introduction and setting the tone for this lecture. It's my great pleasure to have been asked to say a few words before we invite Jonathan to the podium. I want to begin by thanking my co-chair, Michael Atzman, and of course the DMN committee, as well as Lucas McCarthy and Eric Vandenberger from the Faculty Senate Office, who have been amazing to work with and without whom this event would not have come together as it did. A special thanks also to our colleague, Rebecca Modrak, who volunteered her time to create this meaningful graphic design for the event that you have on your program. It is hard to have an academic freedom lecture this year without addressing what is the elephant in the room, and it is, of course, also related to today's topic. So I want to begin with the first few lines of a statement issued by the National Committee of the American Association of University Professors on October 24th, titled Academic Freedom in Times of War. The short and powerful statement begins with the words, "It is in tumultuous times that colleges and universities' stated commitments to protect academic freedom are put to the test most." As the Israel-Hamas war rages and campus protest proliferates, institutional authorities, the statement goes, must refrain from sanctioning faculty members for expressing politically controversial views and should instead defend their rights under principles of academic freedom to do so. It continues, at the heart of academic freedom is the protection of free and open inquiry, including expression of controversial ideas that some may consider wrong or offensive. Academic freedom not only protects faculty speech in teaching, research, and institutional decision-making, it also protects the right to address the larger community with regard to any matter of social, political, economic, and other interests, meaning that extramural speech, as well as intramural voices criticizing administrative decisions or action, which often occur in highly charged political moments, must not be subjected to institutional sanction. The call of the AAUP comes in the wake of sanctioning faculty speech in support of Palestinian Arab Muslim students, their rights to protest, their right to be safe on campus, their suffering and fears, anxieties to be recognized by universities across the country. It comes in response to sanctioning speech that seeks to contextualize, historicize the events, especially when that speech and academic discourse points to the long history of oppression of Palestinians. A measure, as one of my Jewish students noted, forecloses constructive dialogue. The pressure on faculty and graduate students not to speak on the issue of Israel-Palestine, of course, is nothing new. And preparing for these remarks, I wondered what Chandler Davis would say. He, for many years, stood at this very podium, setting the stage for this lecture. And I remembered, as I briefly met him in 2019, as we prepared for this lecture, that he had written a statement and he had circulated among us. And this statement, i.e. what Chandler would say, was titled "No Premature Burial of Academic Freedom," and it was saved on his computer as "In Ann Arbor Appeal." When he wrote, what he wrote then might have actually been written yesterday. It was not popular, he says, or he cites him, he says that this would not be a popular statement, but then, of course, Chandler Davis was not out to gain popularity, but rather to seek justice. He writes, I quote, "Let's take for granted that it is legitimate on campus to call a crime, even if the victims are Palestinians. One can say," he writes, "in the halls of the United Nations, that it is unethical to hold under military control all the lands Israel occupied in 1967, to introduce large numbers of new settlers into territories and enfranchise them, but not the original population, to hold 2 million people, mostly already refugees, in the Gaza Strip in conditions essentially of imprisonment." And I would add here that at this moment, living under complete siege, under bombs, denied water, food, electricity, and so on. To condemn these Israeli practices is not only tolerated in the international forum, it is the prevailing opinion. At the same time, candor about Palestinian struggle and their rights is challenged as acceptable speeches on campuses. The 31st DMN lecture speaker, Dima Khaledi from Palestine Legal, in 2021 inventoried what she called the Palestinian exception to our free speech right. Chandler, too, in his appeal, cites examples of academics whose tenure cases were contested, some even denied, based on statements in support of Palestinian rights, and then he compares his and his colleagues' dismissal in the 1950s. With the dismissal based on perceived, based on perceived communism were, of course, many more than those related to pro-Palestinian political speech, he writes. I quote, "There's one effect that looks very similar. In the 1950s, any untenured academic might be leery of signing a petition critical of the US fighting a war in Korea, take for example, knowing it would be vulnerable to public attack. The same went for criticism, of course, of the capitalist system. In the present period, criticism of Israeli treatment of Palestinians is subject to the same chill," he writes. "We all know perfectly well that if you want to criticize the occupation of the West Bank, you had better reflect on your job security because Canary Mission is watching you," end of quote. When Chandler wrote these words 4 years ago, he not only addressed the status quo, but also eerily predicted what we have been seeing in the last month. We have witnessed the rise of documented threats against Jewish, Palestinian, Muslim, Middle Eastern, and South Asian origin students and faculty alike, leading to mounting concerns for personal safety. At Michigan, in particular, we have seen doxing, intimidation campaigns made up of threatening phone calls, emails, verbal abuses, and threats of violence against faculty and graduate students who urged President Ono to recognize the anxiety and fears of both Jewish and Arab, Palestinian, and Muslim students in the aftermath of Hamas's horrendous massacre of Israeli civilians on October 7th. Chandler shared his commitment to academic freedom with, or it perhaps was inspired by his wife, historian Natalie Zeman-Davids, who sadly passed away on October 21st of this year. Natalie Zeman-Davids was an inspiration for myself as a historian, a pioneer in the field, and an outspoken champion of academic freedom. As a graduate student in Michigan's history department, Natalie, together with her colleague Elizabeth Duvan in psychology, anonymously composed a pamphlet called Operation Mind, chronicling the House Un-American Activities Committee's history of persecution and issuing a warning of its dangerous shackling of academic freedom. As demonstrated at that moment in the case of the University of California's loyalty oath, Duvan and Zeman-Davids write, "It is clear that when university professors are judged not on the basis of competence, but on the basis of towing the line of orthodoxy in their personal beliefs, education suffers." They write, "There is no area of human endeavor which needs more the assurance of freedom from fear and intimidation than the instruction of young people in pursuit of knowledge. Our universities must, if they are to produce sound thinkers, be able to judge values for themselves, be in fact and in theory free marketplaces of ideas." Both Chandler and Natalie would agree with the AAUP's recent call on college and university administrations to fully protect the academic freedom of their faculty to teach, conduct research, and speak about important issues both on and off campus. Chandler would add, and as he insisted in his Ann Arbor appeal, that, quote, "We must fight for the right to discuss freely and not let academic freedom be buried prematurely." It is now my great pleasure to introduce Dean Elizabeth Beer-Moje, who is the George Herbert Mead Collegiate Professor of Education and an Arthur Thurner Professor of Literacy, Language, and Culture in the Marcel Family School of Education. Moje teaches undergraduate and graduate courses in secondary and adolescent literacy, cultural theory, and research method, and has been awarded the Provost Teaching Innovation Prize in 2010. A former high school history and biology teacher, Moje's research examines young people's culture, identity, and literacy learning in and out of school in Detroit, Michigan. She has widely published on these issues, including 5 books and numerous articles. She is a member of the William T. Grant Foundation Board of Trustees, an elected member of the National Academy of Education, an elected member of the Reading Hall of Fame, and in 2022, she received the Oscar Casey Award for Distinguished Contributions in Literary Research. She also received the Senior Career Distinguished Scholar Award from the National Council of Research on Language and Literacy. But not only is Dean Moje an accomplished scholar, but her work as faculty and as dean of the School of Education has created really important projects and educational programs to support educators and families in Detroit, our neighboring city. So I welcome Dean Moja to the podium, who will introduce our speaker. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Tanenan. Did I say it correctly? Tanenan? Yes. Very good. And welcome to all of you. I want to echo my thanks for you being here, and really, or I should say echo Tom's thanks, Dr. Braun's thanks for all of you being here and being so committed to this extremely important topic. I have the great honor of introducing Dr. Freedman, and I won't spend a lot of time repeating or replicating what Dr. Tanenan so eloquently said and the channeling of Dr. Davis, but I will say that this is a most critical time on our campus, and I really deeply appreciate all of you being part of this effort. So let me tell you a little bit about Dr. Freedman. He holds a Master's of Arts and a PhD in International Education from New York University and has received many awards for his teaching, research, and leadership. He was a 2019-2020 Fellow of the University of California's National Center for Free Speech and Civic Engagement. He has published sociological research on universities, nationalism, and globalization, and taught courses at NYU, at Columbia University, and at Bard College's Open Society University Network. Formerly, he was part of a research team examining the production of knowledge on world regions at the Social Science Research Council, and served as administrative director of the Multinational Institute of American Studies, an exchange program for international scholars based at NYU. Currently, and we'll probably talk a little bit about this work, Dr. Freedman is director of free expression and education programs at PEN, P-E-N, America. He oversees research, advocacy, and education related to academic freedom, educational gag orders, book bans, and general free expression in schools, colleges, and universities. In this role, Dr. Freedman drives forward PEN America's efforts to catalyze a more informed civic culture among the rising generation on college campuses and actually among the general public. He oversees PEN America's Free Expression Advocacy Institutes for Youth, as well as its centenary event series, Flashpoints, Free Speech in American History, Culture, and Society. An interdisciplinary scholar by training, Dr. Freedman has served as lead author on PEN America's reports, and I'm just going to name some of them. Banned in the USA, The Growing Movement to Censor Books in Schools. That was a 2022 publication, and at that moment, I also, where'd Dr. Tanenan go, want to give you a shout out on the excellent t-shirt. I don't know if everybody saw it, but it says read banned books. Banned in the USA is a second report, Rising School Book Bans Threaten Free Expression and Students' First Amendment Rights, also 2022. You're a busy man. Third, educational gag orders, legislative restrictions on the freedom to read, learn, and teach, 2021, something that's very near and dear to my heart as a literacy scholar. And Chasm in the Classroom, Campus Free Speech in a Divided America, 2020. This is certainly not the full range of his work. And I will take a moment, just as an aside, to comment on how difficult it is to write about these issues. It takes great care and thought. And so to be so prolific while also taking that great care is something I really admire. So kudos to you. Dr. Freedman has facilitated workshops and conducted advisory meetings with senior leaders, faculty, and administrators at dozens of colleges and universities across the country, and for numerous higher education organizations and professional academic associations. And I'm going to say publicly that he said he and I could follow up after this, so maybe he's going to be helping the Marcel Family School of Education as we navigate these critical issues. I hope you can see why Dr. Freedman is such an important person to have this conversation with us. As faculty members and as human beings, we are all concerned about academic freedom and freedom of expression more generally. As we work together to imagine a campus and a world where people are free to express their views with both integrity and respect for the views and feelings of others, we stand to benefit greatly from your tutelage, Dr. Freedman. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Jonathan Freedman to the podium for the, let me get it right, Davis Marker Nickerson Lecture of 2024.
Thank you. Thank you all so much. What a kind and warm welcome. So what we're going to do today is, really easy and also really difficult. The opportunity to talk about freedom of speech, academic freedom inside a university, we would think this would be the most boring topic. What could there be to say about it? We all agree about this. We all know everybody outside the university agrees about this. Let's go home. This is what we do every day, right? Except, of course, that's not the case. And I'm going to talk a little bit about both what I think is the moment that we're in terms of colleges and universities and its interconnection with what I think are a set of trends that have been unfolding over the past few years across the United States, many of them right here in Michigan, a lot of them in Florida, and really try and help you all to understand the stakes of the current moment. Because the vast majority of the things that I'm going to describe are things that we have seen be challenging in the United States before. This is a picture of a magazine behind me from 1951, and it says, "Do colleges have to hire red professors? Parents can rid campuses of communists who cloak themselves in, quote, academic freedom." And you'll find, if you start reading the history of a number of these issues, that everything that we're seeing right now has some kind of historical parallel. What is unique and what is the kind of clarion call that is necessary right now? And this was the case on October 6th, and it is even more the case after October 7th, and I'll tell you why as well, is that we have to understand that this is, as a whole, unprecedented. We actually have never had this many different kinds of threats to different kinds of free expression really all at once. And while I'm going to focus a lot on universities, I think that the conversation about universities is deeply interconnected with a conversation of what I would think of as an entire set of knowledge institutions. You can see this if you Google, for example, what's been going on in Hungary this week, which is that in Hungary, in the National Museum, a museum director has been fired for curating an exhibit that had photographs of an LGBTQ community from the Philippines. Fired because they say this is against a law that makes it illegal to put such photographs in places where minors can see them. And in fact, in Hungary, not only has the museum director been fired for these photographs, no minors under 18 are allowed to see them, even with parental consent. Now, you're thinking, well, these photographs must be illicit, lewd, lascivious, obscene. We have all kinds of words where our mind goes, there's no nudity, there's no sex, there's some cross-dressing. That is what someone has lost their job over in Hungary. And you think, well, what does Hungary have to do with these trends in the United States? But the answer is actually a great deal. So why me and why Penn and why now? What's interesting and exciting about Penn, where I get to work every day, is that it's 100 years old, and it was started after the First World War. And it was started much like actually the AAUP and other organizations, the ACLU, in a period of time in which citizens were coming together to say that something was wrong with, well, the world, and that the conflict in the world needed people who were other kinds of citizens to come together to try to create a better way of being, a better way of communicating. And if you read some of the founding documents of Penn in the UK and Penn in the United States, was this kind of idea that hadn't really existed in this way before, which was that writers should stand at the intersection of literature and human rights to protect open expression in the United States and worldwide, to, at the same time, work to dispel all hatreds and stand against the suppression of any form of suppression of freedom of expression for the unhampered transmission of thought. And here's the part that's kind of hopey-changey: the ideal of one humanity living in peace and equality in one world. Again, it seems so simple to say, so difficult to do. So that work at Penn and that idea has undergirded a range of writings that we have done over the past 6 years on campus issues. In particular, recognizing that the college campus has such a unique place in American society, particularly in educating young people. You know, the kind of vision of a pluralistic democracy where citizens understand what it means to be surrounded by difference, what it means to be a kind of citizen, what does it mean to be conscientious of others, to recognize the line between rights but also respect, etc. And through this time, over the past number of years, we have developed guidance for campuses. Some of this is available online. We have focused on academic freedom issues and speech issues for young people. We've articulated a set of principles for college campuses related to upholding free speech for all. But we have also, because of this work, been in a unique position to start to call attention to what was, a few years ago, a relatively quiet cottage industry, and then it exploded. And this was the industry of legislating free speech on campus as the solution to any kind of problems on campuses. Professors are too left, conservative students are being shut down, Milo Yiannopoulos or Ann Coulter got protested too loudly. We need new laws about campus free speech. Now, some of the laws didn't actually at first go after all of those things. Some of them were just more broadly written. It wasn't clear that it was going to turn into what it has become. But starting about 3 years ago, really at the end of the Trump presidency, something shifted, which was an effort to take these laws in new directions. And that has been a big animating part of my work. And I mentioned before, we do lots of work on college campuses. Now, in order to think and talk about academic freedom and to talk about this moment that we're in, it's critical that we start with, what do we mean when we talk about free speech? What is academic freedom anyways? Is academic freedom free speech? And what the heck is free expression? These questions circle a lot. I'm going to try and make it as simple as possible. They all kind of blur into one another. Okay? Speech often is more of an American cultural term. The Supreme Court in the United States tends to talk more about free speech. The world of international human rights tends to talk more about free expression. But in the United States, we recognize free speech can include burning a flag, right? And we also recognize that free speech might include the way that we dress, whereas maybe for some people the term expression seems to reflect all of that. But at the end of the day, we're talking about freedom. And I think what's critical for people to understand, and I start with this point because it is the common framework that actually most of us lack in any conversation about these issues, which is, well, what are we even talking about, right? Is anything free speech? Is everything free speech? So let's do an experiment, thought experiment. Let's imagine we're a society and we want to draw lines around what we think is permissible to say to other people and what is not. And in many ways, actually, we do this all the time. We all have rules when our kids get in the car about how loud they can sing to the music, or we tell them don't swear in front of grandma because I'll get in trouble. We have an idea about when you're, even in this room right now, what are the rules here about speech, right? Go ahead, tell me, right? But we have cultural understandings, right, that we're here in certain roles. So when we think about something like a university, or when we think about something like society, democratic society, the problems get a little bit bigger. They get a little more complicated, because we're not talking about situations where we ourselves have rules for our own children, right? We're talking about situations where governments make rules, external authorities have the potential to exercise power. And what is so interesting to me about the history of the United States, so unique in the world, is just how radical and revolutionary, right, a notion it was at the beginning. The revolution is won through press freedom, right? The ability of people to write things in news, the inability of the government at the time to stop those ideas from circulating, and the encouragement of people to, well, get together and start a revolution. And so as a result of this, okay, actually the approach to this question is more open in the United States than really anywhere in the world. It has led to a kind of skepticism, which you can trace through American history, about giving too much central power to authority to govern how people talk to one another. And you can see this in many Supreme Court cases where people will say, you know, like, maybe the facts of this case I lean a certain way, but I'm concerned about the implications of what we do on this for everything else. And that's actually not always upheld by every Supreme Court justice, but the general arc of it is pretty consistent. And when you think about this in the abstract, the truth is most of us don't want to live at either end of this spectrum. Do we, and are we prepared to live in a place that's full of total free expression, where anybody could say anything? I mean, how could we hear one another? Ought there to be some rules somewhere? At the same time, I think most people do bristle at the notion of total regulation. And if you look, again, at American history, the politics of this have actually also shifted over time. The term free speech is not held onto by anyone on the political spectrum. Today, free speech has become more of a clarion call on the political right than on the left, but it was not so just a hot minute ago. It was on the left. It was Frederick Douglass talking about a plea for free speech in Boston. And I love this line: "Slavery cannot tolerate free speech. 5 years of its exercise would banish the auction block and break every chain in the South." Most of us today are not connecting the challenges that we have around free speech to this history at all, to a history that was virulently against the abolitionist movement, that burned newspaper production and killed people who advocated for the end of slavery. Emma Goldman, feminist, anarchist, deported for the things she said to the Soviet Union. In her deportation hearing, she says, "Every human being is entitled to hold any opinion that appeals to her or him without making herself or himself liable to persecution. What becomes of this sacred guarantee of freedom of thought and conscience when persons are being persecuted and driven out for the very motives and purposes for which the pioneers who built up this country laid down their lives?" Now, here she is, 100 years ago, talking about free speech, right? This sort of clarion call, we must have free speech. But I think that and Goldman and others in her time were also pushing back against very clear regulations. Things like the Comstock laws of the era, which gave Anthony Comstock the individual power to open people's mail and to determine what he thought was lewd, lascivious, obscene, immoral, indecent, and put people in jail. Comstock used to sign up to receive things that he thought would break the law. Then when he got them, he'd arrest people. And one of the targets of Comstock, of Anthony Comstock, who was himself an evangelical Christian and believed in that it was his personal kind of calling from God to make America more moral. One of the things that he early on targeted was women who were trying to encourage and teach other women about birth control, how babies are made, pregnancy, abortion, right? So in that era, free expression meant something to many people that it no longer seems to mean today. But if we kind of follow these activists and we say, okay, you all get free expression, we have more free expression for these ideas that are going to change society, we're going to have greater individual liberty, it's important to have free expression for social change, we're going to have free and open inquiry, the easier spread of information so it can't be censored. The challenge is that there is a trade-off, which is that if we move towards this side, we also have to recognize that we're creating a situation that is more permissive of hate. And hate is a challenge for us to figure out from a free speech framework because it undermines that very framework. It says, yes, we all have free speech, but also that means people have the freedom to dox me if I'm a student, to attack me, to criticize me freely, to protest at my house at all hours of the night. Ought there to be, again, some limits? Can you spread horrible lies, stereotypes, ethnic slurs, denigration of people? And in the 1970s, this is an image some of you will know from a famous case, the Skokie case in Illinois, where the ACLU, after having fought for the rights of many civil rights groups to protest without governments stopping them in the South, took up the cause of a group of neo-Nazis who wanted to march in a suburb of Illinois where there were numerous Holocaust survivors. The ACLU won. Now, why would they do that? Well, because they were willing and buying into, at the time, this notion of this trade-off, that if we empower the government a certain way, it will have a negative impact. And I think that throughout history, there is a strong argument to be made that the regulation of hate speech in many countries does lead to suppression of one kind or another. In France right now, for example, there are stronger rules against anti-Semitic speech than there are in the United States. This has meant that it has been easier for France to put in place laws against pro-Palestinian rallies. Now, we don't have that same tradition here in the United States. It means that we all have to kind of live with a lot more contention around this on campuses. But what will, I'm sure, I hope, usually is the case, where when I start to talk about this stuff, people usually bristle. And maybe you're going to bristle too, which is maybe you don't believe in that you say, you know what, we do need some regulation. France got that right. We should move toward greater regulation. But when you do international human rights work, you immediately start to see around the world how these laws are easily manipulated, how they can become more dangerous, even just through simple laws. For example, you can't teach people things that are unpatriotic. Well, what does it mean to be unpatriotic? I mentioned that law in Hungary, right? And so when we're thinking about more regulation of speech, we are inevitably talking about authoritarianism. We are talking about governments that kill journalists. We're talking about governments that imprison musicians. This is a picture of Valsero. He was a rapper imprisoned in Cameroon for rapping about how the military was killing the country's children. In Myanmar, there were journalists who were thrown in jail for writing about the Rohingya massacre. In Russia, Oleg Sentsov spent 5 years in a Siberian penal colony for his criticisms of Putin, right? So it's very clear when you look around the world that most Americans, whether we all like to feel like we're, owning the words liberty or free speech ourselves today or not, we know we don't really believe in this kind of regulation, right? That this realm of less individual freedom, state control of ideas, the suppression of minority views, etc. So where did we land on here, and what is the kind of gift to today, the legacy, the First Amendment? And the First Amendment is one way of thinking about the challenge of how we draw lines around speech. It is the American way, right? There are other ways in other countries. And the legacy here has been largely to distinguish between speech, words said to other people, and speech when it becomes action, right? So in most cases where the First Amendment has, where it's been determined that there is speech that is unprotected by the First Amendment, it is speech that crosses the line into being something more than speech, a genuine threat, harassment, which is severe, pervasive, repeated, objectively offensive. fighting words, etc. But at the same time, although the First Amendment officially says you can make no law about abridging the freedom of speech, we have laws about abridging free speech all the time. There are laws about where you can walk with a megaphone at what hours. Right? There are all kinds of laws about speech all the time, but the key, some of the keys that impact how the judicial kind of traditions have evolved here is to think about the distinction between public and private institutions, and that there needs to be a kind of reasonable or government interest in any kind of law about speech, and that law must be viewpoint or content neutral most of the time. And I'm simplifying for the lawyers in the room who are going to say it's more complicated, and it is. But in general, if you want to understand it, the notion is that sometimes you can make some laws, but you really shouldn't be trying to engage in official suppression, right, in order to do so. So a law like nobody can walk across campus with a bullhorn is different from a law that says this particular group cannot walk across campus with a bullhorn, or even, let's say, there's a group that's been walking across campus at noon every day. We know what they stand for, and now we're going to ban that practice because that particular group has been doing it, right? All of that, in free speech and suppression, when you do this work, it's like when it smells funny, it usually is. Because it's much harder to live with speech that we don't like than it is to try to think about or use power when we have it to try and control it. And inevitably, when we're talking about institutions with power, or institutions that have interests, donors in universities, students who want universities to do things against professors, parents who want schools to do things, in terms of removing books from their children. In each of these areas, what we're talking about is this desire to find some way to censor that speech rather than to find a way to live with it and allow it. And if you apply that principle, you will find it easier, I think, to understand these rules and these laws and what can guide somebody who believes in free speech across different realms. Now, what are some examples, right? Famous cases. First Amendment history is fascinating. It's a lot of fun. I encourage you to get into it. Tinker v. Des Moines, 1969, says that high school students, don't shed their constitutional rights at the schoolhouse gates. Also said teachers don't, by the way, but we'll put that one aside for now. That was a pretty radical idea, because until then it wasn't so clear that high school students, that teenagers, had free speech rights in schools, and this created a revolution in students' rights, which has been pushed back on by subsequent cases. But then in the most recent case 2 years ago was a ringing endorsement about a school not being able to punish a cheerleader for cursing about her cheer team on Snapchat. In that case, she cursed, somebody took a screenshot of it, gave it to her coach. She was kicked off the cheerleading team. It took about 4 years to be resolved. But there is a case where free speech wins. And actually, there's a whole lot of cases where free speech wins, and where if free speech as a concept and what it means actually evolves. So free speech today could very well be different from free speech tomorrow, because free speech is kind of what we make it in the United States. That's the beauty, curse, whatever you call it, of the way that we make law and the way that society evolves. Free speech today is not the same as it was 100 years ago, 150 years ago. One of the ways that speech cases were originally litigated in many cases was the notion that if the speech was going to cause like a bad intent, which is so vague, right? I mean, you can use that to stop just about anything. And so we've actually seen over 100 years here victories for more speech, more openness. But now it's created this other set of challenges, which are actually much harder. How do we live together? So free speech in Cohen v. California was about the F word. One man's profanity is another man's lyric. That's the quote from that case. And what do you know? Since that case was determined 50 years later, language flows a lot more freely off the tongue these days than it once did. More free speech, right? Texas v. Johnson, about burning flags. And I think what's important to highlight in this one is that this case was really about what does it mean to be patriotic as an American. That's what really was being litigated here. And one of the previous cases they looked at was West Virginia v. Barnett, which is about whether students should be compelled to stand for the Pledge of Allegiance. In these cases, what the justices talk about is how in the United States, we don't need to force people to be patriotic. because we believe in liberty. So we're not the kind of country that makes this kind of action illegal because we believe that people should kind of come to and appreciate the liberty, appreciate the flag for what it is on their own. So that's just how anti-regulation, that authoritarianism, that kind of fear of that skepticism of authority that I was talking about before. Snyder v. Phelps has to do with people out of the Westboro Baptist Church protesting at the funerals of gay soldiers. But there, what was debated was this was intentional infliction of emotional harm. Should it be protected? Should that still be free speech if they were gathering on a sidewalk, not in the cemetery? And it was. Okay, so even on a campus, a public university campus, a group who wants to gather and might be inflicting emotional harm, might be saying things that words that other people find menacing, that is, if you follow this case, clearly free speech. So this gets us back to then the problem. So how do we live with hate speech? What is hate speech anyways? People use hate speech all the time. Hate speech has no single definition in the United States in terms of its application to law. There's not a kind of speech in the United States that is said, okay, well, those words are hate speech and therefore they are illegal to say. It's not the way this works. Now, we do recognize what we mean when we talk about hate speech, largely from international human rights law or other countries, where we're talking about, pejorative, discriminating, negative stereotypes, right, against a group of people, usually based on a protected characteristic or an identity factor. But the challenge is that hate speech, if you make a law just about speech itself, you are granting that power to whoever is in power to determine when speech crosses the line. So if it is illegal to say something that is hateful or denigrating to a group of people, and the phrase Black Lives Matter is determined by the president to be a symbol of hate, and you were responsible for painting that, well, you could, I don't know, go to jail, depends what the penalties are for doing it. And so this is why many people who believe in free expression, democracy, equality, justice, a whole manner of powerful values that most people in universities believe in, are very skeptical about strengthening the regulations against hate speech. And so what it means is we have to think about other ways of living with hate, what's often talked about as counter speech. Here's Nadine Strawson, a great book on this, Why We Should Resist It, Hate, Why We Should Resist It with Free Speech, Not Censorship. She says, censorship of hate speech, no matter how well intended, has been shown around the world and throughout history to do more harm than good in actually promoting equality, dignity, inclusivity, diversity, and societal harmony. Now, on a college campus, does this mean anything goes, right? Are there no rules against hateful speech? Because the college campus is a very complicated environment. In fact, it isn't one environment, it's many different environments all at once. Nobody can tell you what is happening at the University of Michigan right now. No one person, no one can tell you what is happening at any one university. Nonetheless, we expect the president to know everything that's happening or to be responding to it, or some other communications office. And so that office and those leaders have to hold, on one hand, these rules about speech, at the same time, an understanding of things like discrimination. When does conduct cross the line? When does the Civil Rights Act apply, or the 14th Amendment? In many cases, I think what's critical is that the response by a university to the speech isn't supposed to depend on any one characteristic, where it's religion or nationality or someone's LGBTQ or race. And those policies are supposed to consistently address all kinds of bigotry. But this is a challenge, because you, on the one hand, are saying there are things people can say that cross these lines, and it's very hard to say anything that crosses these lines because we have a high bar for free speech. So it's not simple, and it's not easy, despite the feeling that this should be a simple and easy thing to do. And I think there are plenty of examples, actually, where students or other organizers have gotten more clever about free speech that can serve as exemplars when we're dealing with situations where speech may not cross the line. Because in actually the highest number of cases, whether speech is illegal, whether someone should be punished for it, is not something that's going to be determined right there in the moment. It's something that's going to be determined in a court case in a year. And people in universities, a professor has to react to a disagreement amongst students right away. A university has to react to dueling protests happening in the immediate. And in those moments, the law is really just one question. We have to think about not just the law, but the academic commitments of the university, or the idea that a university is supposed to be an inclusive space. And in a lot of cases, things that can help with free speech situations are empathy and understanding of difference, right? Listening, condemning hatreds of different kinds. It is less so about censorship, punishment, as it is about other kinds of tools in our toolbox that may not feel as immediately satisfying to most people. Now here's some cases. In Germany, this is a fun one. A German town essentially encouraged this group of neo-Nazis that came to march there every year by celebrating their arrival and hosting a walkathon where the proceeds would be donated to national organizations that fight neo-Nazis in Germany. So they said, if you show up and you walk a certain mile, we'll collect a certain amount of money and we'll give it to the people who fight you. And if you don't show up, well, then we also win. And so they engaged in this kind of highly elaborate sarcasm. The German speakers in the room will know what the pink banner says better than I do. But it's more clever than just stopping them and shouting at them, right? It changes the relationship. And so often what we have seen on campuses is that censorship really doesn't actually a lot of times accomplish what people want. It gives a lot of energy to whoever is being censored, even if their message isn't so great anyways. In a lot of cases, it's better to ignore, right, someone on campus than it is to try to corral everyone to shut them down. At Middlebury, a group of students learned this lesson well. When a Polish politician was there who had been accused of being homophobic, they planned what they called a Dionysian celebration of LGBTQ rights outside the lecture hall where he was to present. And then the university actually shut it down before it happened. And there were so many op-eds. Oh, the snowflake students, they can't even let this event happen on campus anymore. And the students got really mad. And they wrote to the university leadership and demanded that they say that they didn't shut it down because the students actually didn't do anything. They couldn't have stopped an event if the university stopped it before it happened. And why exactly they did that? Maybe they were worried about the controversy. There's this sort of knee-jerk anxiety that happens when a speech event on campus is going to get heated, because we forget the fact that none of us are really ready for that moment, and we aren't doing a good enough job to prepare our university communities for it. So the students got mad, and I just love that story because I think there are more clever ways that we can be teaching people about these things. So why free speech, right? To summarize, we're talking about the law of the land. We're talking about the morals of free speech as an inalienable, universal human right. We're talking also sometimes about the human aspects of free speech, the need to express ourselves artistically, right? All of us can imagine a situation where we might want to paint a painting or tell a story a different way, and someone is standing over our shoulder saying, you can't do it that way, and how that makes us feel. Right? That is instinctual. We understand that free speech is part of democracy. It's how we debate. It's how we evaluate ideas. It's part of social change. It's part of the skepticism, as I mentioned before, of government. And of course, the big one that's missing here, the university and academic freedom. So what is academic freedom then? Okay, we covered free speech. You're all experts. Moving on. Universities, academic freedom. What is this? So academic freedom is fascinating because it has actually a kind of parallel and distinct history that in some moments has verged into the legal realm and in other moments exists not in the legal realm. It exists in this realm of universities and faculty senates, and the idea that what really ought to govern the university isn't necessarily just the university leaders, but some kind of democratic body of faculty. And the history of this is actually very surprising to most people. They don't know that some of the origins of the AUP and academic freedom have to do with the idea that appointing faculty should be like appointing judges, okay? It's a lifetime appointment, and then you're free to do your work without the executive having the power to stop you. That's surprising. It's also surprising to people when they learn that academic freedom actually has 4 core components that were articulated by the AAUP. Research, Most people believe in that, academic freedom of research, teaching, but it's the other two where a lot of the issues come up. Public debate and internal criticism. So engaging in what's called extramural or public engagement, or criticism of the university itself. And why would you need academic freedom to criticize your university? Has everything to do with the history of this, right? Which is about people who work in universities and actually the tug of war between administrators and academics about who's really in charge of this place anyways, and who ought to have more power. Now, today, if you were to survey all the faculty of the United States, all the university presidents, everybody's talking about academic freedom. The truth is, actually, people don't realize they don't agree. Because when push comes to shove, most of the academic freedom cases that are really tricky are not ones that involve research and teaching. They're all these ones that are emerging about tweets or about something said at a public protest. And it's less clear how far academic freedom goes. Where does academic freedom become your free speech rights as a citizen, or where there is also academic freedom as a professor? And I find it's useful to think of it as a kind of bullseye. So on one hand, when you are engaging in academic speech, and when you are in an academic context, it's like everyone knows that's academic freedom. You're at an academic conference, you're teaching a class, it's a syllabus, you're writing a journal article. It's where we move out of that, where some of the doubts and disagreements arise. So where it's expert speech in an academic context, we agree. But where it is non-expert speech in an academic context, it's a little less clear. So let's say I have a PhD in, I don't know, biostatistics, and I'm teaching today's class on biostatistics, but I'd like to start by a conversation about yesterday's elections. And we spent half an hour just talking about yesterday's elections, and there was a syllabus, we were going to talk about it, but we didn't do it. Now, I'm not an expert in yesterday's elections, and we spent a whole lot of today's class talking about it, and a whole lot of students didn't feel like they had time to get answers to the questions about biostatistics. Is it my academic freedom? It's an academic class, is it my expertise? What about when we're talking about expert speech in a non-academic context? So it's my expertise as a social scientist, but I'm writing in the New York Times. Is it still academic freedom? And the most difficult ones are the ones that are the non-expert speech and the non-academic context. Let's get into some examples. So, show of hands. We'll see. There's no wrong answers, unless you're wrong. Chemistry professor spends 30 minutes of a lecture talking about yesterday's local school board election. Academic freedom, show of hands. Not academic freedom. A few, okay. Education professor writes a blog under a pseudonym that gay men make bad public school teachers. Academic freedom. Not academic freedom. Who doesn't know? A lot more uncertainty. English professor calls the university president a corrupt jerk on Twitter, but then says it was just a joke 24 hours later. Academic freedom. Some people, oh yeah, wow, a lot of people think of, okay. How are people not academic freedom there? Non-academic freedom. Political scientist publishes in a relatively obscure academic journal that Antarctica was settled by aliens and humans should worship them. Academic freedom. I see. Non-academic freedom. I want you to observe what I have observed, which is there is absolutely no consistency across this room, okay? That as each of you has had to be forced by these scenarios, which are really, many of them or things like them happening, we actually don't agree about this at all. And if you were to ask, you could be a room of university presidents, you could be a room of people who've written about academic freedom, it would be the same result. Because it's a concept that we know makes a certain amount of sense and has a clear kind of legal basis in one way, but then again, as we move out from that center, no one's really sure. Now, the maximalist interpretation of this is that the professor has academic freedom for all of it, okay? The professor is an intellectual. The professor is supposed to be able to ask difficult questions, right? This is the legacy of Galileo, of people who have been challenged to engage in paradigm shifting. They should have the most academic freedom or free speech for anything. And in fact, what you're suggesting, the maximalist interpretation, is that professors have more free speech in theory than anybody else. There's no other job like it. The reality is that we haven't really resolved this, but nonetheless, universities, particularly in today's university where we expect black and white answers, immediate punishments or reprievals. I talk to people all the time who tell me their universities, they have offices that they've created to receive students' complaints about things professors say in class. And these offices are 24/7. They can't keep up. They have to assign ticket numbers for how many complaints are coming in. And the offices often are being set up without clear rules about what they should do with all the complaints. So we know we're getting a lot of complaints. We made an office. We haven't decided who's going to make decisions about these complaints. A lot of department chairs will tell you, yeah, they've been figuring it out on the fly, and deans as well, because all of these tensions are actually happening all the time on college campuses, in a kind of culture where increasingly people feel like if they're upset about something, instead of telling the person, maybe it's students who feel intimidated by a professor, they should kind of find their boss, and tell them. And then there's also the students in academic freedom. And if we couldn't decide where academic freedom was for the professors, we are not going to be able to decide where academic freedom is for the students. Okay? Now, we know there's some pretty clear things. We know plagiarism isn't academic freedom, right? We know threats to other students are not academic freedom, harassment, right? Irrelevant arguments, falsehoods, unsupported claims. But actually, the questions about how far a student can take a debate in a class with a professor aren't written in stone. They do have to be negotiated between professor and student, and actually, that's the fun part of academia, okay? And that's the part where we do have to figure out a new way to teach young people and to train professors to accept a lot more of this ambiguity instead of looking for kind of simple cookie-cutter administrator reactions. Now, I remember this one example of a professor who was suspended from teaching for showing a video that a previous student, it was a student project related to make videos. It was a student's project from a previous year. Some amount of this year's students got upset. They complained. The professor was suspended from teaching the class. Then the professor apologized, and then a whole bunch of the students said, well, we like this professor. We were just kind of mad that day. Can't we have her back? But this kind of knee-jerk suspension of professors, trying to respond to these situations has all been unfolding really fast, again, without clear guidelines on most university campuses. And so for me, similar to how, as I was talking about earlier, that the legal questions are not the only questions that matter, we can also similarly apply that same thinking to all of these, which is to say it's useful to have a set of principles, okay, that can guide us even as we sort out where the law is in a lot of these cases. That we can, believe in the university's power to model democracy and civic engagement. That in the most number of cases, we're trying to encourage people to side with speech. And I think it's important that we can complement protecting speech with asking people to be conscientious, right? To condemn hateful speech, condemn discrimination, and defend people's right to say what they want if they're doing it legally. I think this is a kind of idea of the university that needs to rediscover the notion of what we might think of as good friction. Because if you close your eyes and you think about a university where everybody has free speech, that is a pretty loud, cacophonous, disputatious, outrageous, radical place. I mean, and nobody actually wants to work that place, and yet that's the point. We have to find some way of embracing that once again and encouraging universities to be places where we might not all agree, we might not get closure on this, we might not solve this issue, but let's talk about it. Let's listen to each other a little bit. Let's, as a regular part of business, make every day of university life having opportunities for people to talk to each other. Now, that's actually the last thing that most university leaders want, because what they want is cheer, pomp, donations from alumni, people to have a positive experience. But in many ways, it's the challenge at the core of a lot of this. The need to help all of the students, all of the professors, all of the administrators come to some shared understanding that good friction can be a positive force for the institution, and that an institution that has a lot of different ideas and a lot of opportunity for different people to speak to each other is actually doing a much better job for democracy than anything else. It's in this context that we have to talk about the incredible and shocking rise of state censorship. Because while everything I've been talking about so far in the abstract sounds great, a university where all these things can happen, a culture where we all listen to one another, it's hard. We may not be able to get there. But we have to also at the same time recognize that right now, one of the most significant impediments to this, and which is also impacting this moment, is this effort to exert ideological control over public education in a way that pushes out other ideas and that involves, in many ways, what we would think of as acts of official suppression. Now, unlike most people, I have been paying attention to these dimensions, these dynamics, pretty much, living and breathing them for 3 years. And I can tell you where we are in year 3, this third school year of this, than where we were in year 1. Now, again, there's a prehistory, okay? But really, Act 1, starting in 2021 and 22, was 2 things. One, there were all these stories about activists and communities and new groups forming around the country, putting pressure on school districts to ban books. And at the same time, there was this effort to ban the 1619 Project from being taught in schools. And then soon after it, this list of divisive concepts that was kind of copycatted across state lines. Now, some of those laws passed, some of those bans happened, but in year 2, all the laws went in a whole bunch of new directions. And suddenly, it wasn't just divisive concepts. Now we were talking about other kinds of laws being tinkered with. Laws about what's called harmful to minors, or an increasing focus on either passing the first kinds of laws, or passing a second kind of laws, or a third kind of laws. And all the while, more and more activism in schools, some of which has impacted universities. In the third year of this, we are now at a place where the chilling effect is actually just happening without laws being passed. So in Florida right now, a whole bunch of school districts are initiating on their own reviews of books in schools without anyone saying you have to. No one is challenging Hemingway in this county in Florida that just banned 3 of his books. It wasn't because anybody objected to it. No one is objecting to it. People are just nervous. And that we haven't seen quite happen to the same extent in higher education, to the extent that people are willing to tell you about it. But it is happening in higher education quietly, and it has been happening since, in higher ed in particular, since the wake of the George Floyd murder and the ensuing protests. Which is, if you remember, those of you who were on Twitter, in the summer of, I think it was 2020, there was a hashtag called Black in the Ivy. And all these people were talking about racism in higher education. It was like everywhere, all these stories. And then it all disappeared. All that energy is gone. And what I hear is about how no one at that university will tell me on the record, but actually they and everybody they know who's a professor in that state doesn't talk publicly anymore. They don't want to go to a public library. They don't want to give a public talk about racism in American history because they're afraid it will draw negative criticism or they'll lose their jobs. I remember a phone call about should one of these groups who helps settle international refugees, higher ed refugees, professors from abroad, should they start developing a plan for the United States to help settle professors from parts of the United States in the other parts of it? That's a real conversation, so that's happening. So it is not being as well documented because professors aren't even going to talk about it, okay? But if you really start asking them, they'll tell you about books they don't teach anymore, topics that they're taking away. And some of that was already happening in response to what we might think of as like student censorship, cultural censorship. Oh, the students don't want me to talk about this anymore. I shouldn't teach this thing. I've always taught it a certain way, etc. But we have to separate that kind of cultural interaction from the political, legal one, where we're actually talking about, like, what, putting people in jail for giving out books or teaching ideas? I mean, that is certainly not what we're talking about when we talk about, notions of liberty in the United States. And what we have to reckon with is this rise of what we have called educational gag orders, precisely because they seek to suppress how we talk and how we teach, how we encourage people to read, and how we encourage people to think. And it is unquestionably in direct response actually to a period of time that saw the most free expression than most of us have seen in our lifetimes. It's not a coincidence that for many years people were saying, we need more diverse literature in schools. We need books about same-sex parents and families in schools. As those books just started arriving, we are facing the most significant effort to suppress those identities in a generation. Same thing in higher education, right? It is directly connected to the 1619 Project and the conversations that effort seemed to spur around the country. And it moved from being, this is an effort to ban or control the 1619 Project, to, the real problem isn't that, it's divisive concepts. No, it's not that, it's C, R, and T. We'll put them together, that'll be the problem. It's not even CRT anymore. Then for a while it was gender and sexuality. In a lot of cases it's not that anymore. Now you will see, and I would not be surprised to see a law proposed next year that bans something like woke teaching in schools and universities. Why would you try and write a law with a word that has so many possible interpretations? Because the vagueness, right, the chilling, the ambiguity is the point of a lot of this. In fact, if you looked at something like the debate on the floor in Florida about what was called the Don't Say Gay bill, there were all these suggestions to make that bill a little bit clearer that were rejected one by one by one, like something like 19 different suggestions to reword this, to reword that. But when the bill passed, it said that you cannot allow discussion of sexual orientation or gender identity in schools, kindergarten to third grade. A year later in Florida, that law has been changed by another law that says actually it's from kindergarten to 8th grade. And that has also been adjusted by a policy passed by the State Board of Education that applies the same concept to pre-K through 12th grade. That's Florida right now, where also there are school districts that are saying they can't teach a Shakespeare book from start to finish because there's just too many parts and too many words they're going to have to explain. So what they'll do is instead take snippets. We'll just learn a sonnet here, a sonnet there. We won't touch any of we won't touch the story as a whole. So this is having this impact, okay, on the quality of education in America's public schools. And it's not just in places where, it's not just in schools. So these are laws that impact universities that have been passed around the country. But it's also impacting higher education. And it's impacting a range of things in higher ed. Because if you think about a law that is vaguely worded about how people feel or conversations about race or sex or gender, it immediately starts to impact a whole range of fields of study. In fact, the first phone call I got about the divisive concepts legislation, the first ban by Trump, like the next day, was not by somebody talking about race at all. It was somebody who does trainings to encourage women and mothers to be scientists. And she said, is anybody paying attention to this law? Because I don't think I can do my training anymore. I said, explain, what do you mean? She said, well, I can't talk about sex differences at all. So how do I talk about the fact that most men who don't pause for child raising have an easier time advancing their scientific careers? How do I give a presentation on that anymore? And I said, oh, I don't think it's going to be that bad. Do you really? And that's where this goes. And it has been going in all sorts of directions: history, literature, business. How do you talk about disparities in who is CEOs in America if that means talking about racial differences in who are CEOs? Can you just talk about facts? So whether you yourself feel that the climate for you to teach your topics was becoming more censorious in the United States. There are some people who felt like, the kids have become so left. I'm a more conservative professor. I can't teach things the way I used to. I think it's very quickly becoming clear that these laws aren't slowing down and that they have these wider impacts. Let's say you're somebody who doesn't think that teachers in schools should teach young people about being gay at all. You just don't think it's important. You don't think that should be there in second grade. But in Florida right now, that school district that banned Everywhere Babies, a children's book, because somebody said it was pornographic, that's a real thing. There's a school district that just banned Atlas Shrugged, Ayn Rand, banned, alongside Hemingway and Updike and Margaret Atwood and Toni Morrison. So at a certain point, this is starting to get somewhere that I think actually a lot of us should be a lot more uncomfortable with, whether there are areas of disagreement. And that actually is the history of how we have worked these things out in the United States, which is ultimately coming to a view that there is a kind of common aspiration to common freedom. What about in states where there's no bill or law impacting higher ed? Laws just about schools. Why should university professors bother if you're trying to get tenure? Well, here's where it does still impact higher ed. For example, teacher training schools. So if you are the part of a university that has to teach teachers to be teachers, how do you do that in a state where all these laws are impacting what teachers can do? Or what if there is concurrent enrollment programs? A lot of high school students take college-level courses in high schools and these sorts of things. So there's these diffuse impacts. Increasingly now, I think in part in response to people saying this is censorship and we ought to stand up for it, which is I think the only reasonable approach, now a lot of these laws against schools and universities are moving in a new direction. And we have a new report which was out today, which is called America's Censored Classrooms, which talks about this. And what it is a movement toward laws that are going to seem more anodyne, but allow censorship in other ways. So instead of banning what teachers can teach, let's just get rid of tenure. Instead of banning what can be taught in schools, let's make new rules about how all parents have to be informed about anytime anything LGBTQ comes up in a school 30 days before it comes up, which, by the way, exists as a law in Tennessee and was recently used when a librarian told a parent they were going to be teaching about a book about a kid with two dads. The parent called the school and got the librarian to not teach the lesson. So all of these things sound like they might not, well, some of them sound just as authoritarian as others. Others masquerade as sounding a little less directly censorious, but when you look at what the politicians are saying or you think about how they're going to be used, it's very clear that this is this part of this multifaceted effort to control things. Banning DEI offices and initiatives. Maybe you are somebody who really hated the diversity statement that you had to write. You think they're contrived. You don't think there's a simple idea of what diversity means anyways. It seems like someone's asking you to do a performative essay about diversity. But do you really think that the government should be banning how the university hires professors full stop? And because what we are seeing in each of these areas is what starts as one kind of regulation leads to others. And again, I'm not trying to say everything universities do is perfect and does not require government intervention, but particularly when we're talking about ideas, information, expression, academia, we have to start to be concerned about what's at stake. This brings me back to the book bans. And I'll just say a word quickly about this, because although right now the book bans are largely in schools, in many, many states, the book bans have targeted public libraries. There's a library in Louisiana where 200 books were put in back rooms for a year. These aren't children's books, adult books. They had to be wheeled out if you wanted a book. In Indiana, there's a new law that has, in anticipation of that law, one school district one library, public library, got rid of all of its YA section entirely. There's a proposal in Oklahoma to have it so that public libraries have to card people before they come in. So anything beyond a children's level book, you would need to show identification in order to get into. And it's not just public libraries. It's also museums. So this is one of about 9 state bills we saw last year, which say this: the purpose of this bill is to remove schools, museums, and public libraries from the exemption which protects these types of entities from prosecution for distribution and display to minors of an obscene manner. Okay? Or if you look at this one, you may have to squint, but essentially what these laws are doing, this one in North Dakota, is they're taking laws that exist about obscenity, right? The distribution of content, pornographic content, obscene content to minors, that historically there are protections for people who are what are called sometimes education professionals or knowledge institutions. So for example, a painting, a Picasso painting in a museum. And when I mentioned that Hungary story at the beginning, people go, well, that's Hungary, that's crazy. They're not going to do that here. But the thing is, 9 states have already proposed laws like this. And what I think is really telling is that you notice they're just trying to take out, the proposal is just to eliminate the protections that exist. Just one whoop of the pen there, and nobody is pausing around, nobody's like, okay, well, we'll cross out school, but let's leave college and university, or, oh, well, museums, we all value art, so we'll keep the museums protected, or the library. It's all just in it together. And I think that there really isn't an appreciation enough of the fact that the ways these laws have been written and somewhat settled for a long time has worked for the free flow of information, for libraries, for museums, for universities, but they are all increasingly in the crosshairs. And when you look at the content of these books, again and again you will see it is books with LGBTQ characters, books with protagonists of color, books like, a children's story about Ruby Bridges or Martin Luther King, but it's actually as often the targeting of those books and the careless desire to just get rid of any books. So for example, in some districts, you have like a list of books that might be circulated, like, this is a set of books that will encourage diversity and inclusion in schools, and we think you should order them. And so what has happened is some people have taken those lists and said, aha, this is the list of the books to ban. And in other cases, people have said to ban the list without actually looking what's on it. So it might not be the case that somebody thought that the Berenstein Bears book about going to church was really offensive to them, but it was just on some list and they didn't notice. They didn't notice that Roberto Clemente book on the list. They didn't notice Ruby Bridges was there. They just not necessarily attuned to that. In other cases, it's very much targeted. That section of that textbook about Harvey Milk in one California district led to them trying to ban a whole textbook. It's also important to say just a word about the sex education piece of this, which I think is really important. We can't deny also that this assault on intellectual information, ideas, how we teach people, is also happening at the same time as a growing effort to control women's bodily autonomy. And I don't think enough people realize that these two things are not disconnected from one another. The effort to ban books that teach people about sexual assault or teach people about body parts, right? And here, you'll hear this argument a lot, which says, well, it was really upsetting, harmful, triggering. I read a book with this content, or my child did, and it was very upsetting to us, and therefore the book shouldn't be allowed to be read by someone that age. But we have to consider the counterfactual. So here's Rupi Kaur talking about her poetry books, which have been banned all over the country. She says, quote, "I remember sitting in my school library in high school, turning to books about sexual assault because I didn't have anyone else to turn to. This is the reality for many students. We all find comfort in literature that reflects our experiences. Now that books about sexual assault and other topics are being banned, I worry for students who rely on school libraries for access to literature." And her voice, and when you talk to many of the authors who have had their works attacked in schools, they'll tell you they wrote the books that they wish they could have read when they were that age. And this is all growing, okay? Growing and growing, again, in multiple directions, where it's clear that there is a campaign to criminalize education, to criminalize librarianship. Have you met librarians? I've had the occasion to meet so many librarians who tell me they love nothing more than shelving a book they don't like. I've shelved 1,000 books, one librarian told me, and I objected to most of them. but it was like my duty to put those library books in that library shelf. That's how librarians talk about their work. And librarians are trained, right? These are professionals, right? We're not talking about people who just sit and randomly pluck books and put them in schools. We're talking about people who have advanced degrees. So again, we're talking about the university when we're talking about libraries. We're talking about the future of the university and what it means to live in a society where we believe in that kind of expertise. But nonetheless, right now, we are seeing this kind of appeasement. So maybe it's somebody in a school board or a principal or superintendent who never liked that content anyways and is all too happy to get rid of it. A lot of the time it's fear, and a lot of times it's just indifference. You know, well, what's that one book with a black story or another? Let's just, I don't know, can't we just replace it with another one? I hear things like that all the time. And this is coming also with bills to ban drag, which have been very popular in a number of states, but also are written in the most vague circumstances. Things, you know, versions of language like, if you perform on a stage and you wear makeup or a costume or clothing that is inconsistent with the traditional dress of your assigned sex at birth, that should be illegal. So what does it mean, the traditional dress of your assigned sex at birth? What does that mean? Does that mean we will stop women from wearing pants? Does it mean men can't wear earrings? I don't know what it means. But a lot of these bills have that implication, and they're going to impact even, and we're seeing this, not just like trans kids and trans people existing in any arts whatsoever, but even like putting on a play like Twelfth Night, where the characters cross-dress, right? Or about a million other plays, because theater has so much cross-dressing. So what's on the horizon? More. We are seeing, again, a movement that has succeeded, okay, at suggesting that the answer to these problems is government intervention, censorship, right? No one else is doing enough to stop this problem. And I think it's really critical that we understand and talk about what was called the elephant in the room in this context. Because it is in this context where this elephant in the room has become all the more dangerous. Because the opening is already there to be seized, to advance an effort to silence, in particular, certain forms of political speech in the United States. That under 3 years ago, if we weren't already in a situation where people thought, and we're normalizing increasingly, that the answer to campuses that can't, you know, teach kids where the rules are, is government speech. And that is what people are turning to. So are we surprised that Ron DeSantis quickly, in the wake of the last few weeks, put out a ban on Students for Justice in Palestine, saying that this club, he says, has engaged in material support for terrorism because they have supported Hamas. Now, material support for terrorism doesn't sound like something a campus student club is doing. So what does that mean? Well, material support for terrorism means giving money, giving weapons. In some cases, it can mean giving expertise. Now, I don't know about your political science undergrads, but I don't know if they're doing that, okay? But nonetheless, there is this kind of willingness and openness to use laws as the solution. Now, similarly, anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, like these are real problems, as is racism, as is anti-LGBTQ sentiment. But the answer, we have to be very cautious about an answer to this, which is going to suggest that what we ought to do is use the law, right? Advance more control over how people interact with one another because we don't like the ways that people are interacting. And so the answer to this, in all of this, isn't going to be a set of laws that proposes that it will be the solution to how we confront hate or anti-Semitism or whatever it is that are going to introduce new mechanisms to censor people. The answer is going to be, we got to find ways within universities to teach people, right, what are the rules about free speech, what are the rules of engagement, how do we talk to and listen to one another? And if we cannot establish some kind of baseline where when we go through a bunch of, you know, academic freedom scenarios, most people at a university campus have some idea and aren't shocked that other people might answer those scenarios a different way than them. If we can't do that, then increasingly we are inviting that this kind of legal, political, legislative solution is going to be put forward. And it has already been there. Years ago, before any of this, There was an Anti-Semitism Awareness Act, which was proposed. Again, probably with some good intent, but also with an intent, or at least the potential implication, that it would lead to censorship of voices critical of a political government around the world, right? That is a problem. And we have already seen as well in many states efforts to ban boycotts of Israel to control how people decide to participate in something like what's called the boycott, the BDS movement, right? To make it so if you want to get paid for working at our public university, you have to sign something that says you will never boycott Israel. I mean, these are loyalty oaths of a different kind, and it's the kind of thing that is totally inconsistent with a commitment to free expression for all people. And so if these ideas or this movement wasn't already in the wings, right, to try and advance greater censorship, it sees the moment that has been birthed through everything that I've been talking about, and it's going to be trying to piggyback as well. So what are we going to see in 2024 is just this movement growing in more and more different directions, and it is vital that we all not try and celebrate the effort to censor our enemies, okay? Because inevitably, what's clear is censorship begets more censorship, and it's sort of coming around. So what do we do? What do we do? I think what's critical, again, is about education. We have to return to helping everyone to understand these things and encouraging people to avoid overcompliance. In so many parts of the country right now, it's the chilling effect. It's the fact that people are more afraid of what might happen, so they curb their remarks in one way or another. They curb their teaching. They're pulling books. They're doing it quietly, etc. We have to encourage people not to do that. We have to encourage people to talk about this a lot more. If you are a professor, you probably know someone in one of these states. You probably know what they're not teaching anymore. Tell them to talk to me. Tell them to talk to someone. Tell them to talk to you. Tell them to write down the story. Because much like the end of McCarthy era led to a kind of overflowing moment of all these stories and information, of all these ways in which people felt censored and suppressed, I have no doubt that that is what is going to be on the horizon in the next few years. I think that we can be encouraging universities to play a lead role in this, and that is something that is incumbent upon whether we are students, professors, etc. And I think, again, there are very simple, specific answers to this, which is the legislation controlling how people talk and circulate information is the road to authoritarianism. And instead, we have to think about solutions inside universities. And demonstrate as well that universities can solve this, that universities can be places, again, it's not going to be somewhere where we agree with everybody all the time. It's never going to be somewhere where we love coming to work. But it can be somewhere where we at least understand, there are certain guarantees of safety, of personhood, of the right to express our ideas, to be heard by others, and that has to be the kind of baseline. Universities can return to some first principles around freedom of speech and freedom of expression, and they can help people. What is the most shocking thing to me when I visit a university campus is that nobody is talking about this at all. Most students do not start college talking about academic freedom or free speech. Most professors don't start college or as professors or their graduate degrees. They don't know any better than the students do. And so we've created an environment where the administrators, the staff, the faculty, the students, the senior leaders, not only do they not all agree, they don't have the tools and they don't have the education to be able to handle the situations that are in front of them. My final remark comes from Lori Hals Anderson, whose remarks I think are so vital to understand now, particularly for universities that are thinking about their role in training the rising generation, which is, if you think about it, censorship is the child of fear and the father of ignorance. Thank you very much. Now, I believe we have a little bit of time for Q&A.
Time for questions. If you have questions, Michael right there, Lucas standing, and you may
And you can ask anything here.
Although it seems straightforward to me as you're talking about you don't want government actually infringing on speech. When you have things like curriculums, you necessarily have a finite amount of things you can put in the curriculum. Choices are made about what goes in, and therefore certain things are kept out. If there's institutional, whatever that might be, but not government necessarily, making those choices, and there's either an agenda or a point of view that actually does that, isn't that censorship? And if it is, if government doesn't do it, what's the cure? Because I think they're going overboard, but I can understand the other side too. You're making choices. Those choices essentially ban that book. If that child is never going to see the book again because it's now out of the curriculum because you've made a choice to put something else in there, that's censorship too. You can't have everything. Choices need to be made, but if those choices are not made in an ecumenical way and actually represent a particular point of view, that's censorship. And then if the public doesn't agree with that, how are they supposed to actually combat that? So I agree about this side, but I think the other is more subtle, but it is definitely there. And we see it on campus too. I mean, again, that's the whole idea of whether conservatism in the campus that are more liberal, do they fear actually even speaking out in doing that? That's much more subtle, but it's there. And how do you deal with that part of it? Not necessarily bringing government in to be able to do that. What would be the right way? Thanks.
A great question. Thank you. It is more subtle, and it is there. I think what's key is would we call it censorship, right? In the same way, can we call it? Is it something else? To me, when I think about, I have thought about things like soft censorship, right? The kind of soft feelings that people have that they should remove things, quiet censorship, right? I think we have to distinguish between that and curation, particularly when we're talking about academic environments, schools, libraries, universities. We're talking about experts. Now, what's a really interesting question in these different areas is, should the decisions, let's say, for a syllabus be decided by the individual? Is academic freedom mine and yours, or is it ours? Is it our department's? Do we decide as a group? I think that's another one universities aren't so sure about themselves. But I think it starts to get to the root of how I think we solve this a little bit, is that we have to distinguish between those curatorial decisions and then deciding to not make something available at all. So it's one thing to say, To Kill a Mockingbird, had a lot of value, but these other books can also have value and maybe we should teach those. That to me is different. Let's say a committee of educators, parents, different people are talking about that, from To Kill a Mockingbird is going to upset us, therefore we must never see a copy of it at all. Right? So pulling it, again, also like the school library can function as a resource, what's been called a space for voluntary inquiry, when we do have to make those curatorial decisions. Or similarly, in the university space, the university library, which is massive, I think that's where also things like additional reading lists. But I also think there's something, because I don't want to avoid the question, because I've experienced it myself as a professor too. And what I did, and what I think more people ought to encourage each other to do, is actually, when they face that moment, to keep that thing on the syllabus, or at least to keep something on the syllabus that suggests there's a greater debate or dissent or a history of people disagreeing about this, right? I think often there's this urge to keep things more current, or a lot of professors have felt pushback about choices they have made. But inevitably, it is leading to that kind of more anodyne teaching, or the removals of classics and other things. And I don't think personally that is a solution to this. But I do think at the end of the day, we have to distinguish somehow between the conversations that we need a space to have and an opportunity to have around schools and libraries and museums and universities, versus a kind of heavy-handed way in which a lot of this is being carried out. That's, you can't teach this, you can't have that, or whatever. I wouldn't beseech anybody who said, I taught the 1619 project and I don't want to anymore because I'm doing this, that, or the other thing. I think it's very different from Florida saying, you can't teach the 1619 project because I said so, right? I think we can see a difference there. Now, in terms of the question about what we ought to do about it, I think this is where the vision that I have is one of kind of renewal, opportunity. Let's say the way that this works a lot of times, the professor finishes the class, the students do the survey, and they mostly decide whether they liked if the professor cracked enough jokes or not, right? There's not really an opportunity to say to a group of students, what do you feel you've learned? What do you feel was missing? Or professors, let's audit, this program. What are we teaching? What are we not? Where are the gaps? Let's embrace the fact that most universities have even in departments, different ideas about things. Let's encourage people to lean into those differences rather than running away from them. And I do think that interventions like that can be a much better kind of cultural, practical, institutional solution than where this is going right now, because this only leads us to a kind of tit for tat. When this government's in charge, we can read those books, and when that government's in charge, we can read these books, right? Like it starts to sound very, silly. But I agree that even under the best circumstances, it still isn't perfect.
Thank you very much for a very interesting lecture. I think this story of higher education and democracy and how they relate to each other goes back much further than anybody actually suspects. In about 460 BC, the astronomer Anaxagoras wrote a book arguing that the sun is a material body and not a god. He didn't actually say not a god, he just left that out. For 30, 40 years, the Athenian democracy let him teach astronomy. But then there was a bad plague came along, the Athenians suffered some military defeats, and the majority decided to introduce a law banning the teaching of astronomy. And Anaxagoras was put on trial, and he would have been executed had not Pericles managed to get him out of the country. And then they started burning books by intellectuals, and things went downhill because there was a long war going on and people were afraid that the gods would turn against the city. So what happens? This is the problem that we face when not a majority in this country, because they're manipulating minority status, but a substantial minority turns authoritarian. That, I fear, is the problem that we face. And, the minority who have turned authoritarian are trying to wag the dog. They're just the tail. But the democracy doesn't work well enough to give the actual majority that isn't authoritarian enough power to stop them. That, I think, is the problem that we face. I don't know whether you have any thoughts on that. And in particular, I'd like your thought on the role of pseudonyms, of being able to say anything you like under a pseudonym on these social medias. It's a problem. I do think it's a problem. And that's why I voted against the person who wrote pseudonymously on their social media. Even though they were a professor, I really think that's too low. Everybody should stand behind what they argue for. Anyway, that's my comment and question.
Yeah, I mean, as somebody who just loves the history and has really myself tried to embrace learning, that's great. It's very exciting and interesting to learn about that history, which I didn't know.
And I tried to put it in the Times, and they wouldn't have it.
So were you banned?
No, I wasn't banned. They never took my article.
It was curated, right? I mean, I think the questions about democracy and minority majority are really interesting because the majority can also be deeply censorious of a minority. And in fact, one of the other challenges we face at the same time in all of this is whether this was all a reaction to a feeling that the majority was censoring a minority, or the idea that we do have to protect minority views, which is actually at the essence of much of what we talk about when we talk about liberty, right? The right to dissent, the right to be the one person who disagrees, right? So I think that it is imperfect in terms of what we have. I think that the moment, to me, all of this actually, and maybe this is my best answer, is that's why this is the moment for leaning into these conversations. And that's why this is the moment for a real reckoning conversation about how universities are and aren't doing this properly, universities in particular, because it has been very difficult. I don't want to say that censorship has now meant that now we get to have the conversation about free speech we always wanted, but I do see an opening which didn't exist before. And I've done this presentation before where I show, different political sides trying to censor or trying to have more freedom, and we now have a situation where anything can go in any direction. You know, you can be getting, it's actually extremely hard in the politicized context to stand for principles in a consistent way. And that's why it's so vital that universities do. But there are always going to be different schools of thought about this. Like, for example, the question of should the university be neutral on the political issues of the day, or should it take up the positions of whatever its president thinks? Should it issue statements every day or never? How does it do that? There are really different opinions about what is going to be best here, and a range of criticisms which are so interesting. There's a whole criticism which is, well, the university, I don't care what you say, what are you doing about it? You know? Which I love that one. But on the pseudonyms question too, I think there's just a range of opinions. And on the one hand, I'm thinking about a school where they had like rampant bullying through an Instagram account that was pseudonymous, and then basically the principal had to like shut down the school and taught and sort of like engage in an investigation into who had this account, because some of the stuff that was being posted on here was really like targeted at particular students, saying really like bullying to the extreme through social media. But at the same time, I think that there have been some pseudonymous accounts that have allowed people, like there are people who have huge followings on social media and nobody knows who they really are. And they're able to say some of the most interesting and provocative stuff because they're not public. And so I wish that we lived in a time where that didn't feel necessary, where all of us had maybe the protections of academic freedom and in the maximal sense, but the truth is most people don't. Most people have jobs that they'll get fired if they say what they really think. We don't really live in a society that actually truly upholds free expression. And I get this question all the time. Well, here's an example of something being said. What do you think about that? And what if it was a student, and what if it was a professor, and what if it was an administrator in a student affairs? And what if it was a custodian? Actually, I have that one story too. And the answer is, in a real free speech society, it actually shouldn't matter. And here, it matters a great deal, because the analysis of how much speech that person has everything to do with who that person is, the context in which they're saying it, the life moment that they're in, and in many cases, the amount of power or even opportunity to which they were born, right? And that's like a really fundamental reality of free speech that is extremely difficult to reconcile with even the most, free speechy ideas of the university. So there's always going to be challenges, and maybe pseudonyms is just one that we can't solve.
Hi there. My name's Jared. I'm a grad student here, and I am a member of our grad worker union. So I really appreciate this lecture. It's so timely because, as you say, we're in the midst of like an incredible crackdown on academic freedom within an incredible crackdown on academic freedom. We're like a month into a genocide that is being committed out in the open, with U.S. support. And in my department, at least, in sociology and policy, faculty are like actively shutting down discussions about it. There was like a walkout that students organized a couple weeks ago, and a grad worker was doxxed by their own student for just talking about what was happening on campus. Hundreds of parents have signed petitions calling for the discipline of faculty and staff who signed an open letter criticizing our president's response, which really backed up Israel. And we had a bunch of Zionist parents just rally on the Diag last week, and one of our regents, Ron Weiser, was there calling again for retaliation against workers for speaking out about Palestine. And those are, just a few examples of what's happening in like a lot of repression on campus right now. So again, super appreciate this. My question is, speaking as like a member of a union and a department, like from your perspective, what is the role of unions, departments, AEUP, like the Faculty Senate, which I'm really grateful for y'all for organizing this. What is the role of these different groups in this moment to stand up to this incredible suppression of liberation for the Palestinian people? And before I let you answer, I'll just let people know that I have sign-up sheets for like a town hall follow-on event if folks are interested in doing whatever Jonathan advises us to do. And I'll stand at the back if folks are interested in continuing the conversation. But yeah, thank you.
Yeah, it's such a critical question, and the incredible challenges of this moment for like university communities are being felt all over the country. I think it's quite clear that whatever lack of preparation there was for free speech just in general has put universities in a place where they aren't well equipped to figure out how to do this. You know, you have, as you said, like the accusation that academic professors are like not allowing any speech at all. I mean, it's an interesting question from the academic freedom conversation we were having earlier, because there is a question, like, if you were there, let's say, to talk about, I don't know, something in sociology that's on the syllabus, is it reasonable or not to spend the class, I don't know, doing something else? Now, of course, there are moments where I know professors maybe have like a good faith reason to stop a conversation and move in direction, and there are other moments where students do perceive like you're trying to, we were talking about that, about, I don't know, politics, international politics and free speech. This seems like such a relevant topic, why can't we talk about it? And I think it's really profoundly unfortunate. I think a lot of places right now, you know, should we be surprised that in a moment where people are being doxxed, right, for the things that they say, that professors or people in authority to convene and facilitate conversations are even more nervous to, right? Whether they are shutting down the conversation because they don't want to hear what people have to say, or because they're just worried or fearful about, like, you know, where things could go. And then it's this interesting question, which is, well, how have professors been trained to facilitate difficult dialogue? I don't know that most professors actually take that seminar on the route to PhD in publication, right? And so this moment is presenting these profound challenges that were hard to contemplate before. You know, the issues around Israel-Palestine and the suppression in particular of pro-Palestinian speech in the United States have been challenges on campuses for 20 years. I don't know that we've ever seen them at such an intense level as we've seen, where it is impossible for someone who even like follows this news all over the country to keep up. In terms of like what people ought to do, I think this is the moment for speech. And I keep saying this is a moment for everyone to lean into this, right? If you aren't making space for these conversations on a university campus, well, where are they going to be happening? You know, you should be getting people together to talk about this. You should be getting different experts together. Try to have people talk about this, even if there's a perspective on it that's totally at odds with something that your group or any group might believe. I think it's important to use the opportunity to convince an audience of people, you know, how they ought to be thinking about that moral calling to, you know, just the profound assault on human rights. I think that all of that kind of speech has to be allowed in a university, and it is the responsibility of groups like AAUP or Faculty Senate or others to stand up for it. And again, it's no different from how I would say that there's an opportunity and responsibility for professors to stand up for schools and stand up for librarians and stand up for museums, because if this group of institutions can't all start to see their common cause as institutions that support openness and exchange of ideas and art and culture, they are all in trouble in ways that I think many of the people in these universities and libraries, museums haven't even really fully contemplated just how far it could go. But I'm giving you an answer that's going to feel unsatisfactory because I'm going to give you a free speech answer. And part of, I think, the challenge of universities as well is to figure out how to simultaneously give a free speech answer and be a university that stands for a set of values. And it's extremely difficult. It's difficult for professors to do that. It's difficult for anyone to do that. But at the same time, I do think there is something special about the university that obliges it to find some way to do so.
Okay, we're almost running out of time, but there's two questions, and if we can just take them together, perhaps, and
Great.
and then we'll go.
Does your treatment of free expression apply to social media in a straightforward fashion? Or does an environment governed by clicks generated by controversy, lots of anonymous speakers, demand a somewhat different framework?
Do you want to?
I'm concerned about the confusion between criticism and censorship. I'm like about 5 years back talking about this, but the far right has acted as though every time they're criticized that this is an infringement on their free speech rights. And they've used this as an excuse to call in hateful speakers, claiming that, well, they're exercising free speech, they're nobly fulfilling the duty of free speech, and they then focus these hateful speakers. But there's a difference between being criticized and being censored. They're allowed to get the speakers there, but they also, the criticism is also free speech. That's the exercise of the free speech of the people listening to them.
I think that, one thing that's very clear when you look at the history of how people have talked about free speech is that it has become more political. It has been weaponized or taken by a particular group of people who present it as though it's like very common sense. Well, there's free speech, stupid, right? Except when it comes to a set of places or spheres of society where they're happily censoring. And you're sort of like, well, wait a minute. You've been so confident that, for example, I don't know, I think like something like Fox News spent years talking about snowflakes. We can't have students who are, I don't know, unexposed to the world, but also, what if the students read a book? And you're kind of following that media, and it's very confusing, right? So there is a lot of, well, lack of a better word, doublespeak. And I do think it's important, but I do think that it has emerged in part because of a lack of consensus in education about these things more broadly. So, when I've spoken to a lot of audiences, many people who are concerned about sexual content, let's say there's someone who's concerned about sexual content in schools, okay? A lot of times the person has never thought about what they're talking about as taking away someone's liberty, because then that frame isn't given to them. They think it's about their liberty to stop other people from getting stuff. But when you start talking to them about it, it's possible to get into the nuance of this. And so I think one of the points that comes out of what you're saying here is actually that isn't a conversation. It's a one-way kind of shout media match at everybody else, and that's why it's very difficult to engage in a kind of productive way. On the social media, I mean, what a more interesting question for our times, I think that ultimately it's going, I don't have a perfect answer to this problem. I think it's very clear that right now the control of social media by a series of kind of oligarchs is heavily problematic for what was once presented as like the democratic promise. Any of you who have ever read, I think it's Manuel Castells on globalization and how media and globalization was just going to make it such a great, better world. It's going to be so good for everything. And then you read that 20, 30 years later and you're like, well, you did not anticipate, Elon Musk and X. And so I think that the answer is, I don't know that the status quo we have right now is working very well. And I think there are also a set of really serious concerns around social media use, teenage brains, phone usage. Anybody who's a parent knows that this is a challenge. There's a whole conversation advancing about whether schools should be banning phones, etc. Now, I'm someone who doesn't believe in things like banning in general, but even I have to kind of consider and weigh the different factors. I think there's also a really interesting set of challenges around content moderation, where a lot of the time the answer to anything that anybody finds offensive on social media has been curated out and content moderated gone, and at the same time maybe there is a basis for booting some people off of these platforms when they engage in repeated hateful doxing, etc. I think that we need more elaborate, sophisticated solutions to a lot of this, but my answer is always going to be, just as somebody who has said again and again here, in the long run, we have to be really careful about siding against free speech. We have to be really careful about what group of people is being empowered to do this. And even things like YouTube, saying they're going to clean YouTube of misinformation about vaccines. Well, who's doing that? Is it AI? What is getting swept up there, and what group of experts about vaccines is watching these videos to determine where the line is? I don't know about some academic commission that was set up to do that. And so much of the time, a lot of the stuff that gets pulled off is people's expression Or it might be actually otherwise educational content. Videos about the Holocaust, for example, which were pulled off YouTube some years ago because it was so easy to find them and they're so shocking. But at the same time now, if you want to show that video in a class, much harder to get to it. So I think the internet, in the ways that it evolves, continues to pose new challenges. But I would say that apart from a kind of skepticism that I have personally about empowering how we control the future of this, it is clear that some new compact around it or some new set of rules needs to emerge. But I hope that will be arrived at through not, legislative government fiat banning TikTok, but actually like a group of experts coming together to talk about it and propose solutions. The way we used to do things in universities. Anyways, I hope. Fingers crossed. Thank you all so much.
Okay, thank you.
And I have some materials here if anybody is interested in learning more about our work.